and welcome to the Design Rescue Show, where we take a behind-the-scenes look at the unique journeys of creative professionals, and we learn about the choices they've made that have shaped their career paths. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I am your host, David Block, and today I'm happy to welcome designer, author, illustrator, educator, brand consultant, and the host of the longest-running podcast, Design Matters, Debbie Millman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's really nice to be here.
I'm so glad you can make it. And so this show is basically a behind the scenes tour of your career history, your career path. And where I like to begin is I like to take a step back, as far back as I can, and, talk about your education and your influence, early influences. So my first question is, you studied English and you minored in Russian literature. I know that.
Yes, indeed.
At the State University of New York in Albany, right?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. Okay. I would love to know, at what point did the world of design call to you? Was it before, during, or after your time in college? And I'm curious how you fit your English and your Russian lit background into your design career.
Well, I think I always had some sense that design existed, but I didn't know that it was called design. I remember making covers for book reports. And I was very engaged in making all kinds of drawings and decorations and things that were as creative as I could make them in my life as I was growing up. But I didn't know there was a discipline called design. I just thought of it as art or arts and crafts. And so I didn't really understand that there was a whole discipline called design until I went to college. And even then, it took until my senior year to realize that this was something people did and could do for a living. I became the editor of the arts and features section of my student newspaper. And one of the requirements of the editor was also what was then called putting the paper together, which was really just a way of saying old school layout and paste up. And so I learned on the job how to put a paper together. And that was my entry into design. Now, that doesn't mean that I learned everything I needed to know in order to become a designer when I graduated. It was actually only when I graduated that I realized just how much I needed to learn in order to make a living as a designer, and learned very quickly on the job as I started working as an entry-level designer.
I see. Okay. Now, when I went to school in 2001 to 2004, I went to the Art Institute in Orange County, and that right across the street was the Orange County Register. We went on a tour one day, and they took us around. We saw the web printers, we saw the folding machines, all that stuff, and then they took us into a room that was what they called the paste up room. And and you just mentioned that, so I would love to hear about your early experience doing paste up.
Well, I loved it. It was very tactile. Everything was done with your hands. It was all done on a drafting table. Not only did I work on a drafting table in a layout and paste up room, I also worked in a stat room, which had a giant stat camera that you used in the dark because you were developing stats for the newspaper, which were simply pixelated versions of the photographs that you wanted to print. And they were all pixelated in black and white. And so I absolutely loved it. I learned how to use an X-Acto blade and how to cut type. And I was very, very adept at the wax machine and all of the things that you used back then to create files, essentially pre-press, pre-pro files that would then go to production firm that would then shoot it and turn it into negatives to make the newspaper.
Right. Excellent. That's something that I've always been interested in, the early forms of that sort of paste up and putting it all through that whole process. I never got to learn that. So I've always been interested. So
yeah, it was, I'm really, really glad that I got to work in that way. I also was of the generation that first was working on computers. Computers came into our lives as devices to facilitate our design talent in the 80s. And so I was already working on computers in the late 80s, early 90s. And I guess I was a generation of the early adopters.
Actually, I was shocked to see it in 2002 at the register, actual paste up boards like that. So moving into one of your first professional jobs, and I could be wrong about that, but when you were working at Hot 97, right, you went over there,
Yeah,
right?
no, that was well into my career.
Was it?
I
Okay.
I
All right.
started working at Hot 97 in 1990, I think 93.
Yeah.
And I had already at that point been working for a decade. That first decade, I graduated college in 1983.
Mhm.
And so I've been working in the design business for over 40 years, which is quite astonishing and
Right.
scary. And that first 10 years were what I now refer to and have talked about as being a decade of experiments and failure, rejection, and shame, because I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't have any kind of significant design education. As you mentioned, I majored in English literature with a minor in Russian literature. And so I often joke that I have a degree in reading. While that has really provided a wonderfully deep background in culture, it really wasn't all that helpful to getting an entry level design job. And so I really struggled in that first decade. I felt very unprepared to live a professional life. And I didn't have any internships in college. I didn't even know that there were things like that existed. I came out of college with a very tiny, very slim network of friends and contacts that I could depend on, and really had to make my way in the world without much guidance, direction, help, any of the things that can propel you to higher planes
Right. Right.
than what I had when I started.
I see. I see. Okay. So, and then when you finally did get to Hot 97, so my question is that you were there specifically to help with the rebranding from what was dance music to hip hop, right? At that
Yes, yes, and that was a freelance job. I had always had other
time.
full-time jobs while I was working at Hot 97. I was sort of off studio, out of the studio, working, and I worked for a really, really extraordinary, promotion manager named Rocco McRae, and he and Judy Ellis, who was the general manager of the station, first hired me, and, I started working very quickly, first on advertising that was for Hot 97, the dance music radio station, but then worked with Rocco and Judy and another art director named Johan Vipper and Tracy Doherty, who was the program manager, to reposition the radio station as the world's first hip hop radio station.
I'm curious if there were any promotional campaigns that stand out that you might be able to talk about.
Oh my God, they all do. It was really the experience of a lifetime. I mean, we did shoots with Puff Daddy, who was at the time Puffy, Little Kim, Brandy, Biggie Smalls, um, the Fugees, Lauryn Hill. I mean, it was incredible, incredible. A lot of these artists were just making it at that time and just breaking through. So it was extraordinary. When we first started, though, we had zero budget. I mean, we always had zero budget, but when we first started, before the station was a hip hop radio station, in an effort to shoot some advertising campaigns that would help launch the show, we just shot people that were working at the station, because everybody that was working at the station was legit. And so that's the first campaign that we did. And that became the visual language of Hot 97.
Right. Outstanding.
Say Adams did that first logo, and then I worked on the redesign of that logo probably 5 or 6 years later when I was president at Sterling Brands.
Ah,
And
okay.
that's still the current logo today.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So it's like
That's
over 20 years old.
Wow, that's wonderful. And actually, that's a great segue into my next question. You were a partner at Sterling Brands from 95 to approximately 2016.
Yeah.
And that's where you worked on more than 200 brands, like household
Yeah.
names like
Yeah.
Burger King, Tropicana, Star Wars Episode 2, Pepsi, CVS, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
I would love to know, how have you seen the landscape of branding and design sort of evolve? And could you highlight any particular design trends that have affected your process, your philosophy?
Well, when I started working in branding, so I got to Sterling in 1995, the world at the time really vilified designers that were working in branding. You know, they were considered sellouts, or we were considered sellouts. And um, nevertheless, I really loved and still love branding. And I think that branding is way more than a capitalist tool. Branding is the way in which we navigate understanding the world through symbols, through words, through representation. And at the time, I was working for some of the world's biggest CPG companies, and the work that was out there at the time was pretty dismal. I mean, part of the reason I didn't even understand that branding was a discipline was because of the state of package design and branding in the supermarket, which was really rather dismal. Um, I was working at Sterling at a time when the majority of the staff, when I started there, came from the UK. I was one of the first Americans that came to work at Sterling and was confronted with a very different visual aesthetic that the UK designers were accustomed to working in.
Mhm.
And while initially I was perplexed by it, I ultimately came to really admire and respect it. And it was much more minimal. It was much cleaner. It didn't propose that the American consumer needed to be dumbed down with clownish graphics and garish colors. And so I really learned a lot working with the designers that I first encountered at Sterling. I think over the years, a lot of that work has become much more mainstream in terms of what we expect the consumer will be willing to accept. At the
Mhm.
time, we were one of the only, if only, firms doing pre-designed strategy, brand equity evaluation, and now everybody does it. So,
Right.
in many ways, Sterling and that work predated me. I had nothing to do with creating it. I just loved selling it and developing it. But at the time, Sterling was one of the few firms really analyzing equity and seeing how that equity could be advanced and what were the guardrails that existed in the mindset of the consumers and the audience that were loyalists. So that work was and continues to be, I think, really fascinating.
It's interesting. Now, I'm curious if you think it's become more or less difficult to make a brand that resonates with its audience over the
I think
years.
it's always been difficult. It's never been easy. It's never, ever been easy. Whether or not it's more difficult or less difficult, I think really depends on the brand, but it has never been easy. And anybody that tells you it is lying. It's really, really hard to capture the imagination of the consumer, especially when there's so much that they can buy and in so many places they could buy it.
If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you. So in 2012, you did a video series with PBS Offbook. And I have to tell you that when I started teaching, I relied heavily on that series to help me explain what we're doing in this class.
Oh, wow.
And
Thank
yeah,
you.
and I still play it every single year. I play every single one of them, the graphic design one, the logo, the illustration, and so on. But specifically, the one that you opened up, you were in the very beginning of the graphic design video, and you mentioned something that grabbed me. It grabs me every year. I love listening to it. You said, you know, I think ultimately if it moves you, whether it be a good emotion or a bad emotion, chances are it's effective because it's getting you to think about something and getting you to potentially take action.
Mm.
I love that quote, and I would like to hear if you could elaborate a little bit more on that concept.
Well, I think that while I'm really glad that I said that and
Yeah.
stand by it, what I didn't know at the time was how brands were going to come out of the corporation, come out of the ownership and control by the corporation and into the hands of the public, of the people. In that, in 2011, we saw Occupy Wall Street take over. In the subsequent years, we've seen things like Me Too, Black Lives Matter. Those are all movements that are also, because they have a recognizable identity, because they have a recognizable purpose, they've all become brands. And I'm not using brands in a capitalist tool meant to sell something. I'm using the term as a way to identify and differentiate between one movement and another in an effort to understand what it stands for and then participate or not. Humans, people, sort of rescued the term and the ability to be able to understand something through branding at that time, and are now in co-control of this discipline that I think I didn't see coming at the time. I don't know that anybody necessarily did, but that power is even more significant now than it was back in 2011, 2012, and so forth. So I think that what I said, I can amplify further by saying that we as a species have the ability to participate or push back against any movement that we feel is worthy or unworthy.
Mhm.
And there is no such thing as an evil corporation. There are only evil people in the corporation that are reporting those evil ideas. So we have the ability, in participating in buying and supporting those brands or not, to allow those companies to prosper or not. And I just wish that people understood the power that they have in that. You know, a lot of people talk about how they don't feel like their vote counts in any election, whether that be because of the electoral college or because of the numbers of people that vote and not really believing that one vote could make a difference. But what I can say is that every consumer makes a difference to a company's P&L. And if there are boycotts or if people refuse to buy certain things because they don't believe in what the company stands for or what their mission is or how they make something or the ways in which they discard their waste or any number of things, they can make a difference by not buying that thing.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Fantastic. My next question has to do, actually, it's not a question right off the bat. I want to first of all congratulate you on your new book. By the way, I've got it right there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love it. It's a great snapshot of Design Matters, and some really, really great pieces, some great parts to some of your interviews. So first of all, congratulations! And you launched it in 2005.
I launched
It's
the
been
podcast in
the
2005. Yes.
podcast, not the book, obviously. Yes. And you have interviewed lots of professionals from a wide array of disciplines. And I would love to know if First of all, before I say that, it's definitely influenced its listeners. And I'm curious if it has any impact on you personally. So, hosting the podcast and engaging with such a wide variety of people, has it influenced the way that you approach design?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily influenced how I approach design, but it's definitely influenced how I approach life, which I guess encompasses design.
Right.
It's been 19 years since I started the podcast,
Yeah.
and it's almost hard to believe that that much time has transpired since I started.
Mhm.
What was really initially a very deliberate Hail Mary to try to resurrect my creative spirit has become one of the centerpieces of my whole life. And the education that I've gotten by doing the research that I do, the experience that I've gotten interviewing some of the greatest minds in the world has
Right.
been one of the greatest gifts of my life. So it's profoundly influenced me.
That's excellent. I'm curious if there is a sort of a theme across all these years. If there has there been a theme that appears most often or more often than other themes when you deal with celebrities?
Well, I'm really interested in the people that I interview in understanding their origin story. If I were starting the podcast from scratch now and taking the approach that I take now, which is a deep dive into how they have become who they are, I might have called it origin story, only because I feel that that's what I'm most fascinated by. I'm not as fascinated. I mean, I love knowing about their successes and I love understanding some of the backstories into how they achieved that specific thing. But I'm much more interested in who they were as seedlings and how they were able to create the life that they have now. How did they overcome their obstacles? How did they encounter rejection, and what did they do when they experienced it? What does resilience look like to them? What is the path of their creative origin story? And that's really what I'm endlessly fascinated by. I'm much more interested in their obstacles than necessarily their success. Although hearing about their obstacles because of their success, I think is what makes people want to listen to the show.
Yeah, I have to be honest. Your show is a major influence on my show because that's exactly kind of where I come from, and I started this specifically to learn not about necessarily the successes, but what it took for them as a human being to make it in the industry, and stay alive and keep going
Yeah.
and pushing forward. So,
Well, thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate it.
absolutely, and so. Um, Now, there was another question that I have that regarding another quote that you said at a conference that you were at about, I think it was in 2017. It was the 99U conference, and you did a talk called "Anything Worthwhile Takes Time." And
Yes.
so, as you closed, I think it was the very last thing that you said just grabbed me, and it said, "Through the years, I wanted something more, and I expected to be able to get it through earning it." And being rewarded with it. And ultimately, what I found was that I had to make it. And I like to hear how that realization has shaped your approach in your life.
Well, because I got so much early rejection and because it was so hard initially, I always seemed to end up making what I wasn't able to participate in on my own. Although when I started the podcast, there were really I mean, there was a handful of podcasts. Nobody even knew what the word meant for the first year or so I was doing the show. And ultimately, what I've come to really understand in a very powerful way that you really can't fake it till you make it, which is what a lot of people say, fake it till you make it. And that didn't work for me. I think people knew when I was faking. And actually I don't want to be in a world where I have to fake anything, frankly. And so what I've come to understand is that you just have to make it until you make it. and you have to just keep making things over and over, as many things as you can for as long as you can, and hope that something will actually resonate with other people, which is really what making it means. And so I don't think that people respond well to anything that isn't authentic. I think people can always tell. And so faking it till you make it feels like a bad idea to me.
Right. I tend to agree. I tend to agree. A little bit further on, when you were the president emeritus of AIGA, I'm curious if there were any campaigns that you ran that that included the community, that made an impact on the community, the design community.
Well, I was president of AIGA from 2009 until 2011. Prior to that, I had been on the national board. I think I was on the national board from 2006 to 2009. And then I was asked by Sean Adams to take over his job at the time, which was president.
Right.
And because I had had such a kind of turbulent entry into AIGA, where I was sort of rejected from a special interest group that I wanted to be a part of, getting to a point where I had become president was pretty astonishing. And at that point, what I told the membership was that every kind of designer was welcome. And to really solidify what I meant by that, and to really stand up for what I meant, I went and visited every chapter. There were 66 chapters of AIGA at the time, local chapters. And over the 6 years that I was involved with AIGA from a leadership point of view, I visited them all on my own dime and wanted to spread that message of inclusivity. I was also very active and involved in helping to launch AIGA social media at the time. This was 2009, 2010, 2011. Got us on Twitter, did a lot of when it meant something to be on Twitter, and did a lot of advocacy work that way, and also brought people together in that way. And I'm really proud of that work.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. Now, you were also co-owner and editorial director at Print Magazine, right?
Yes.
And as in that position, you're in a really unique sort of position to comment on print versus digital. So I'm curious how you see the future of printed work, magazines, newspapers.
I think the future is whatever we make it. I'm not a futurist. I'm much more of an analyst. I, with 5 friends, bought the print brand out of bankruptcy. F&W Media owned it. And while print was still making money as a printed entity, it wasn't making enough money for F&W, and ultimately the organization and all the titles that they had went into bankruptcy. And Steve Heller, Laura Desenfant, Deb Aldridge, Jessica Desio, and Andrew Gibbs and I all chipped in and bought the assets out of bankruptcy, mostly so that they would survive. I mean, this is a magazine that lasted in print for nearly 80 years, and the archives are vast, and we wanted to preserve those. Yeah. And so we did as much as we could to ensure that that would happen by buying the brand. We were successful at buying the brand. We have kept the brand alive online. It is now a vibrant place that is growing month by month, several 100,000 visitors every month. And we have a cohort of writers that I believe are doing some wonderful design criticism, personal essays. Seymour Quast does a monthly illustrated column for us. And so I think we're continuing to build the brand. I don't know if we'll ever go back to printing. Who knows? Mostly because of the waste. Although there are a lot of people over the years that have told me that they still have every single print issue that they ever got. I know I do. And we now own boxes and boxes of issues that go all the way back to the very beginning. Yeah. And one day I'd love to be able to raise the money to be able to digitize all of the back issues, because I mean, we're talking about artwork and design by Saul Bass and Massimo Vignelli and um, Seymour Quast and Milton Glaser and Paula Scher and all of the legends of graphic design.
Right.
And it would be great for people to be able to have access to that.
That would be amazing. And everything that's old is new again. We're producing, people are producing vinyl again. So, you never know what could happen.
You never know. No, we intend to do that. We're looking for some underwriters. We're looking to see if we can secure some grants to be able to do that. And hopefully we'll be able to make it happen.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. We've actually made it all the way to the end of my set of questions and to the end of this conversation. I have one final question left for you, though.
Absolutely, David. Anything.
So for high schoolers dreaming of a career in design, or even, college students coming out, looking back at your early days, is there a nugget of wisdom that you, maybe not even your early days, any time, is there a nugget of wisdom that you wish that someone would have shared with you that you could impart to our young designers out there?
Well, I would recommend that anybody that wants to do something, do it and pursue it with your whole heart. Don't hold anything back. Don't compromise. If you are just starting out, you are in the perfect place to be able to charge forward and try and make something happen for your life, because only you can make things happen for your own life. And the more you want something should be indicative of how hard you work to get it. Be the person that gets to the office first thing in the morning and leaves last thing in the evening, because what you do now will plant all of the seeds to determine the direction that your career goes. It'll begin to solidify what your work ethic is, and all of those things will help you become somebody that people want to hire and work with.
Right. That's beautiful advice. When I was as a lot younger, somebody once told me, if it's to be, it's up to me. And that actually,
I love that.
That's a motto that stuck with me and that I live my life by. And that actually sounds exactly like the advice you just gave.
Well, what can I say, David? Great minds.
Great minds. Take a look. But thank you so much. Once again, I really, I value your time. I appreciate you being a part of my show. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for having me.